listening to Crossword, where cultural clues lead to the truth of the word. And my name is Michelle McAloon, your host. You can find out more about me and the show at bookclues.com. Today, we've got a great interview with a man named Josh Ireland, who has written The Death of Trotsky, the true story of the plot to kill Stalin's greatest enemy, besides it being a very good tale, a little macabre, but a good tale. You kind of learn of the intellectual heritage of where a character like Vladimir Putin comes from. So it's well worth the conversation, well worth the listen, and well worth the read. Please tell a friend about Crossword Books and stick with us. We've got some great books coming up. Amelia Earhart, Lewis and Clark, Western Lore, and all of this coming up. Really hope you stay with us. And you can find out more about me at bookclues.com. All right. Thanks, guys. Happy listening. God bless. Okay, folks, just on the heels of the news of Navalny being killed by a poisoned frog, we have got an interview today. And this is kind of probably the assassinations that started all the assassinations. Maybe not, but it's The Death of Trotsky, the true story of the plot to kill Stalin's greatest enemy, and it is by Joseph Ireland. Mr. Ireland, I'd like to welcome you to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here.
Okay. Your biography says that you are a ghostwriter. What is a ghostwriter?
I help interesting people write their stories, really. You know, the people who, because they don't have enough time or they haven't got the confidence to write a book, or they don't feel as if it's something that they would be confident doing, then I sit with them, we craft their story, and then after a few months, hopefully we should have a good book at the end of it. And, so I do a range of people, from sort of famous people to interesting members of the public who want to make a record of their life or their achievements or their thoughts.
Okay.
And I find them all equally interesting, actually. I think I'm probably quite nosy. I like the sort of the right it gives you to ask impertinent questions.
Oh, I think that's good. And we call nosy curious around here.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, curious. I think curious is a less sort of a word, less burdened by judgment. Yeah.
There you go.
Curious. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Ireland has written 2 other books that have actually been critically acclaimed nonfiction works. The Traitors in 2017 and his excellent book, Churchill and Son, which was a Daily Telegraph Book of the Year in 2021. His current book is put out by Dutton Press in the United States. And we have to start with very first thing. So the death of Trotsky, which happened, 1940?
August 1940.
Okay, August 1940. And you are a ghostwriter. You're not of Russian expertise, or you're not even a Russian dissident. How did you go about researching this book? Because your research is really good. And according to one of my favorite Russian experts, it's actually extremely accurate.
Well, that is very, very kind. I mean, I think it's 2 things. One is I have always been interested in Russia, by no means a Russianist. I studied Russian history at school and then several semesters at university. That had that sort of foundation that I could build upon. And I think the second thing is there's lots of really excellent scholarship, whether that's someone like Robert Service or Simon Sebag Montefiore. There's this architecture that you can work within, people who have had incredible access to archival material, especially people writing in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, I think what we now know is that has been a sort of window where people could have access to stuff that had been hidden for decades. And unfortunately, that window is probably shut now. And I was keen to be able to gain access to stuff in Russia, but sort of world events overtook me and meant that door really was firmly shut. But yeah, I think otherwise it was just a question of following your interest, doing the sort of detective work that you always do with any book, which is, sort of spending a lot of time reading people's bibliographies.
There's another author that I have interviewed, a guy named Sean Walker with The Guardian, who wrote
yeah.
The Illegals, who also has done extensive research. I interviewed him, I think last spring. Actually an extensively researched book, again, using a lot of archival material. And I thought that your book is a great complement to his book. So to my listening audience, if you get a chance, I will put up that first interview I did with Sean Walker, because both of these actually mirror each other very, very well. The death of Trotsky. Stalin kills Trotsky. Let's start from the very beginning. First thing, tell us who Stalin was, and then I'm going to ask you about Trotsky, and then I'm going to ask you about the beef between Stalin and Trotsky. And this really has to be contextualized. Your book does a really good job of it, of showing kind of the mirror image of these two men and really their deep hatred for each other.
Well, I think you're right to sort of use the image of a mirror image, because there is a kind of very profound similarity, but also very profound differences between the two men. So Stalin's a sort of, like Trotsky, is a creature of the edges of the old Russian Empire. So Stalin comes from Georgia. He's the son of a cleaner and a sort of alcoholic, I think a shoemaker. So there's no sign that he is going to have any sort of imprint on the 20th century. But he is bright, he's ambitious. And then the thing happens to Stalin that also happens to Trotsky. He was also, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I think the parallels are sort of useful. And again, Trotsky, he's from what is now Ukraine. He's the son of an illiterate farmer, but he's incredibly bright. I mean, he's probably too bright for his own good. And whatever he would have done, I imagine he would have had a different life from his parents. But what happens to both Stalin and Trotsky is that they both become, I guess they both have what now seems almost like a Damascene conversion to communism, to socialism, that they are animated by this great drive to completely upend the world as they knew it. And I don't think from our perspective, it's quite hard to understand the sort of depth and strength of their fervor for this belief, their willingness to do anything, to whether that's in the context of their own lives or, as will happen later on, the impact it has on other people's lives. So they're both sort of, that's the sort of propulsion that pushes them forward through the first couple of decades of the 20th century. They both spend time in exile, and that the exile they have is a sort of first clue to the very profound differences in their personality. So whereas Stalin spends a lot of time in Siberia, Trotsky escapes from Siberia and has a much more cosmopolitan life. He sort of skips from England to France to Spain. And then in 1917, the Russian Empire, which has been governed by the Tsars for the Romanov family for upwards of 5 centuries, finally begins to collapse. And there's a popular revolution. And for several months, Russia has its first and you could almost argue its only period of actual something approaching democratic rule. But the revolution attracts Stalin, Trotsky, who are both part of a small group of revolutionaries who are known as Bolsheviks. They realize that this is their opportunity to do the thing that they dreamed of for 2 decades.
But they have a fundamental disagreement. And this is this Menshevik Bolshevik thing, right? The Bolsheviks thought there needed to be world revolution, and Mensheviks thought, or maybe I've got this mixed up. Mensheviks.
Yeah, this is a sort of one of the. I mean, I think there are sort of several reasons why they become such implacable enemies. I mean, some of it is just personality. That Trotsky's a much more flamboyant, intellectually self-confident, eloquent person. I think the thing that people talk about him when they remember him is his incredible ability to speak, to speak off the cuff, to write, to inspire crowds, and that all of this was sort of embodied in his physical appearance. He took a lot of effort in the way he dressed. He wore white spotless suits. His hair was sort of immaculately brushed back. He'd wear these sort of delicate pince-nez over his nose. Whereas Stalin, by contrast, he's more sort of sturdy, and he's more sparing of his words. He's very conscious of the gaps in his education. He's very conscious of his sense of what Trotsky would describe as being a sort of coarse provincial, whereas, Trotsky's a sort of European sophisticate. And so they have a sort of intense physical loathing. But then on top of this is the sort of more kind of obscure doctrinal argument begins at pretty much at the beginning of the sort of in the 1910s, where there is the Russians have social revolutionaries who have a split, and they split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And broadly speaking, the Bolsheviks means the majoritarians, the Mensheviks mean the minoritarians, which reflects about the bulk of the group followed Lenin and became Bolsheviks. And it wasn't a particularly, now it feels one of those incredibly small, fine points of history, but it was an argument about the way in which a revolutionary party should try and seize power, whether it should try and motivate a large group of people, which is what the Mensheviks thought, or whether it should be a small elite cadre who should lead the revolution, which is what the Bolsheviks believed, and which is what they went on to do. Stalin was a very, very loyal follower of Lenin, was thus Bolshevik. Trotsky, much more inclined to go his own way, more sort of heterodox thinker, was sort of tried to steer a middle course, but was broadly aligned with the Mensheviks. So this meant that for quite a long period before 1917, he was alienated from the rest of the Bolsheviks. But I think once the revolution broke out and this sort of chasm opened and with it an opportunity to effect the thing that they planned and dreamed about and talked about for almost their entire adult lives, he puts aside those differences and very rapidly becomes a very significant part of the Bolshevik plans to seize power. And that, again, adds to Stalin's resentment, because Stalin's been this loyal foot soldier for a long time, and suddenly this person who wasn't even part of the organization sort of swans in and is being given, it's a sort of seized center stage for himself.
This is what I don't understand. When was Menshevik or Menshevism, or when was that sort of squeezed out? Because Lenin was very much a Bolshevik. Stalin is firmly attached to Lenin. When did that split occur, that it was going to be a Bolshevik revolution and the Mensheviks, the White Russians or the Mensheviks, were going to be left behind?
In those months between February, when the Tsar falls, and October, when the Bolshevik coup takes place, there is a sort of paralysis. The liberal government, which is trying to sort of continue to keep Russia into participating in the First World War, which has been a complete disaster for the entire country. They've lost millions of people, economies collapsing. Only the Bolsheviks, who are plotting to do anything different, it's only them who have got the will and the ruthlessness to do something which, on the face of it, seems completely crazy, because they're this tiny, tiny handful of revolutionaries. And what they're planning to do is to seize control of this sort of empire of millions of people. And so it's precisely that energy and that ruthlessness, that ambition, that propels them past all the other rival groups. And what Trotsky does is he embodies all of those things. He's a key organizer on the ground. He's there, creating the alliances they need. And he, helps lead the revolution when it comes on in October 1917.
What point did Stalin and Trotsky look at each other and decide, we just hate each other? We're done with each other. What your book really shows is that Trotskyism almost becomes a phenomena in itself in the large imagination of Stalin. I mean, Stalin saw Trotskys around every corner, right? It was almost imaginative in Stalin's mind. But at what point did Stalin and Trotsky decide, you know what, we just hate each other? This didn't work.
I don't think there was any prelude to that hatred. I suspect, it's difficult to be confident when they first were in the same room. It's probably in about 1901 in a sort of shabby room in London, where there was one of the Bolshevik congresses where Stalin was apparently present. And I think Trotsky instantly wrote him off as a sort of mediocrity. When Trotsky would later write, he would characterize him as a sort of grey blur, this sort of bureaucratic mediocrity, whereas he is the shining light, this ambitious, clever, talented person in comparison. I don't think there was ever a moment in their lives when they ever liked each other. But I think it was their distaste for each other sharpened into hatred when it became clear that Lenin was ailing. And then at some point, whether it was, in 4 or 5 months' time, in 5 years' time, someone would succeed him as leader of Russia or the Soviet Union as they were building. And I think that knowledge that they were in a sort of unspoken competition must have tipped over whatever kind of predispositions they had into a sort of very visceral, very fierce hatred.
When Trotsky died in 1940, he was writing kind of a 3-volume book on Stalin, a biography on Stalin. Did that ever see the light of day? Was it ever published?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it wasn't published in his... one of the gruesome details is that he's working on it in his study, or galleys of it are in his study when he's murdered. There are pages into which his own blood has seeped. He hadn't finished it at the time. I don't think he was ever particularly happy either about working on it or about its quality. I mean, I think it's probably one of his worst books. But weirdly, it's also one of his most influential because it was published after the war. And I think it helped, for a long time, it helped set the West's perspective on Stalin. It created this image of the colourless bureaucrat who almost accidentally bungled his way into power and then bungled the revolution. Whereas actually the truth is that Stalin was a much more interesting, strange and talented person, than Trotsky ever gave him credit for. They even after he'd been maneuvered out of the country, even after Stalin had so sort of comprehensively destroyed him and destroyed his career, I don't think Trotsky ever really could see him in any kind of perspective. And then, by the same token, Stalin couldn't see Trotsky with any kind of perspective, even after he'd run him out of the country, even after he'd, killed almost all of his family, almost all of his followers. Trotsky, the image of Trotsky, as you say, loomed in this kind of astonishing way in Stalin's imagination. That this person he'd comprehensively defeated also resembled to him his greatest enemy. And whether that's because he was in some way an emblem of all of Stalin's own insecurities and anxieties. I think one of the other things it illustrates is the kind of strange bifurcated nature of Stalin's mind. On the one hand, he's overrun by paranoia. But on the other hand, he also understands almost intuitively how effectively he can use Trotsky to consolidate his own power, his hold on power in the Soviet Union, turning this demon that exists in his imagination into a demon that exists in the imaginations of millions of people across the Soviet Union. He can justify the terror. He can justify all of the changes he wants to push through. He can justify his ever tighter grip on power because there's this enemy that's going to bring down the revolution, this great experiment that Russia is at the forefront of persisting with. His relationship with Trotsky is a really good insight into how Stalin thought, as much as one can ever do that.
It's interesting because you really do show with the takedown of Trotsky of how the former Soviet Union, how they really operated on foreign ground, how they used the Spanish Civil War, how they used their networks in both the United States and Europe to really a very, very deadly fashion. And you talk about an organization called the NKVD, which I'm not real sure what that stands for, but I know it's basically their foreign intelligence service, correct?
Yeah, well, it's a blanket term for all of their secret police. So it's both foreign intelligence. So it's within the NKVD, which later becomes the KGB, which is sort of incarnation of that organization that we were almost familiar with from the Cold War. So within it, organs that are charged with, domestic security, but also foreign intelligence. So it's effectively, if you were thinking about it as a comparison to the USA, it's the FBI and the CIA, but within one umbrella organization. Each of the divisions within are kind of siloed off. And as always, in sort of a totalitarian state, there's this kind of constant state of rivalry and suspicion. During the course of this book, the person that the NKVD were most interested in was Stalin and Trotsky and Trotsky's followers.
And Trotsky's followers. And folks, this is something that has to really be paid attention to because the NKVD, Cheka, NKVD goes into the KGB, which goes into the GRU. And guess who comes from that? That's Vladimir Putin. And his intellectual heritage is actually this organization that destroyed thousands of people, both abroad and in Russia during the Great Terror. Tell us a little bit about the Great Terror.
I mean, it's one of the sort of central tragedies, I think, of the 20th century, or of history, really. And it's kind of an outcrop of Stalin's paranoia. The sort of astonishing thing about Stalin is that he achieved an unbelievable amount for this sort of peasant from Georgia, but he never stopped looking over his shoulder. He could never stop looking over his shoulder. And perhaps that is part of the reason why he was so sort of relentlessly successful by his own terms. Paranoia was churning constantly inside him. I think he constantly thought there were enemies, there were plots. And partly that's because he came from a milieu which were constantly plotting, which were constantly looking to bring down governments, so I think that, that's the sort of atmosphere within which he moved. I think the other sort of strand is that political violence was built into the Soviet system from the very first days of its existence. They came to power in a violent coup. They then rapidly moved to consolidate that power by creating this sort of whole apparatus of oppression, which, began as the Cheka, then becomes various different organizations before it ends up as the KGB. And as you mentioned, it now there was a brief period when Putin, having been a KGB agent, then led the Russian Secret Service. So he's absolutely a creature of that environment, of that culture. He will say that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest tragedy in history, and that informs his entire worldview. But I've got ahead of myself. But yeah, so political violence against your enemies is completely baked into the Bolshevik philosophy of how you govern. Your ability to rule is kind of a function of your ability to be ruthless. And when you add to that an incredibly paranoid leader who has almost complete control over almost every organ of government, from Moscow to sort of Irkutsk in the sort of Far East, a man who sees enemies everywhere, but who also understands the value of seeing enemies everywhere as a way of effectively terrorizing an entire population into disobedience, and into obedience. Sorry, I think he understood that a frightened population is a population that's easier to govern, that's easier to mold. And the way you terrify them is by killing millions of people, sending millions of others to concentration camps to make sure that everybody lives in permanent fear of the sort of midnight knock on the door.
And Stalin was because he accused them of Trotskyism, right? Not being Bolshevik enough, or not really believing in the revolution. So Trotsky gets thrown out of Russia. He gets thrown out 3 times, but the third time, when was the third time that he got bounced out of Russia?
He first goes into internal exile in 1928. So he's sent out sort of the wilds of what's now Kazakhstan. And then he spends, I think it's until 1933 in a small island just off Istanbul.
Okay.
And then he has a couple of years in France, then Norway, and then finally Mexico. And he's always, treated as this sort of alien, terrifying object by pretty much all the governments of the country through which he passes. In France, he's allowed to stay there as long as he doesn't go anywhere near Paris. It's always a precondition of his being given a sort of residence that he won't try and involve himself in any kind of domestic politics. Because, one of the problems that Stalin had was that Trotsky was perhaps alongside Lenin, one of the two most infamous figures from the first revolution from 1917. When Western leaders like Churchill, thought a lot about the Bolsheviks, when they wanted to sort of terrify people in parliamentary speeches or newspaper columns, they'd invoke Trotsky, and his hands sort of soaked in blood. But he was, the fear he held was also a sort of sign of the way in which people respected him as a sort of very significant figure, even if for them mostly a repellent one. And I think this was another sort of problem that Stalin had, that Stalin emerged almost from nowhere, that people didn't know who he was, but they did know who Trotsky was. And I think even into the 30s, Russia or the Soviet Union remained this sort of mystery to the rest of the world, and its politics were opaque. People still believe that maybe Trotsky was being sent as a sort of Trojan horse by Stalin into the West. So, I think most people were pretty either desperate to keep him out, or once he came in, were desperate to get rid of him, which is how he ends up in Mexico in 1937.
By the time he ends up in Mexico, he is an international celebrity, but he also knows he's a wanted man at this point, because this is in the middle of the terror. People are disappearing. He understands this. He becomes increasingly more isolated. But I tell you, the figure that is almost more colorful than Trotsky in your book is the cabal that tries to murder Trotsky, and this family that comes out of the Spanish Civil War, the Mercadores. Yeah, and the figure of Ramon, and he is who eventually becomes the murderer of Trotsky. But I mean, his relationship with Sylvia at
Yeah. And
yeah,
his
and
mother. I mean, it's an incredible psychodrama. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. When I think that was one of the things that. So when I started looking into the idea of writing this book, I think one of the things that struck me was that the death of Trotsky is sort of one of the most famous murders in history.
oh,
And
absolutely.
you know who puts the knife into Julius Caesar's back. You know that it's Lee Harvey Oswald in Texas in 1961, but you don't know who it is that kills Trotsky. And I thought maybe that's because he was just sort of an obscure, sort of featureless, sort of fairly uninteresting character. But actually, as soon as you start reading about Ramon and also his family, you just think it's this sort of incredible family tragedy, which is once particular to them, but also sort of, I think, also speaks to a lot of the family tragedies that occurred in the 20th century, because they were so completely caught up in the sort of the kind of the grip of the sort of mad political obsession led to so much carnage in the course of 30 years.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what's amazing is, people really got swept up into these movements, and maybe it's a little bit like red and blue politics in the United States today. I don't know. But I mean, people were, willing to give their lives for communism or for the revolution around the world. It was interesting. In this family, actually, it was about 4 kids. They were from Spain. They were kind of this cosmopolitan international family that their son ends up as an assassin in Mexico.
There's a comparison that a lot of historians make between the Bolsheviks and millenarian Christians. They have that same tense fervor, same belief that they are building this incredible new chapter, or they're about to create an incredible new chapter in the story of human existence. But I think what differentiates millenarian Christians and Bolsheviks, or their followers in the decades that followed the revolution, is that the Bolsheviks believed that that prize was so glittering and so perfect and so beautiful that anything was they would be willing to pay any price to achieve it, and they would be willing to trample over anyone that needed to be trampled over in order to get to that point. And I think that's what takes this sort of bourgeois or sort of semi-aristocratic boy from the safety of this kind of prim, entirely respectable family in Barcelona, or it begins, that's how they start, to eventually becoming this person that tricks his way into Trotsky's entourage by seducing kind of very naive American Trotskyists called Sylvia Agaloff, who's on the edges of the group. And then that's what takes him from Barcelona to Paris, where he initially finds his way into the group, and then on to Mexico City, where he commits that murder. Again, it's just as Stalin and Trotsky were propelled from farmland in Ukraine and the sort of dust and heat of Georgia to the sort of the Kremlin by the force and power of their passion for the new order they wanted to create. That's also what drags him out of his, what could have been a normal existence into becoming one of the most, well, he's not one of the most notorious assassins of the 20th century, because I don't think people know his name, but I mean, he protagonist in one of the sort of great stories of the 20th century.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I tell you, the story that you have between Sylvie and Ramon, or it's not the story, but the story between Sylvie and Ramon, the history. I mean, you just want to scream at this woman. No, don't you see that this guy fooled you? I mean, and that relationship was set up by an NKVD agent, right? It was the whole relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a version of what we would now know as a sort of honey trap. But to go back further, although Ramon has his own commitment to the cause, there's no way that he would have become part of the NKVD had it not been for his mother's own relationship with the NKVD, specifically a sort of another incredibly charismatic, slightly raffish but completely ruthless figure called Leonid Eitingon, who she may or may not have had an affair with. But anyway, she was the one, along with Leonid or Eitingon, who brought him into the NKVD. And she's always there in the background. She's either with him or at one remove watching. And so between them, they set up this arrangement where Ramon seduces Sylvia when she's on a trip to Paris. And she's honest, I think, and a good person, but she's incredibly easily manipulated by Ramon. I mean, so easily that I think there are some people who think that she may have been in on the whole plot from the beginning. I don't believe that. But it does seem almost staggering now she was so easily taken in by him.
We almost paint a picture of her being a cat lady. I mean, being a
Yeah,
Hungarian type cat lady,
right.
and then she gets swept up by this dashing Ramon, and she's manipulated. And the reason why she's manipulated is because she had actually been on the outside of the Trotsky entourage. Actually, she was not as involved as they originally thought. I mean, the whole story is just
It's weird because it begins with a bodge. Yeah, right. As you say, it begins with a mistake because
right.
the NKVD think that she's actually the sort of the portal into the Trotsky sort of inner sanctum, but actually she's this sort of tiny figure on the far, far margins of the group. I mean, her sister had worked for Trotsky as a secretary, so she had a sort of degree of credibility with them. There was no sense at all that she was the gateway to what they wanted. To go back to the seduction, I mean, this feels incredibly unfair, but one of the things that almost anyone who talks about her emphasizes is she was quite plain, she was unsophisticated, she was well traveled, but she wasn't a charismatic figure. She was quite mousy. Whereas Ramon was handsome, he was charismatic, he was clever, he could sing, he could improvise stories, he had apparently a good sense of humor, but he was also a mythomaniac. He was an incredibly accomplished liar. I think he had that sort of instinct that all con men have, the person that tries to trick you with selling insurance on the street, right up to sort of someone like Jeffrey Epstein, of knowing what it is you want, what you're afraid of, and then being able to give it to you. So I think sort of to accuse her of being, a willing participant in the scheme is to underplay the dazzling scale and skill of Ramel's seduction of her. There are times when she does have suspicions, when she realizes there are kind of gaps in the stories he's told her, or, people turn up in inexplicable ways, and in his attempts to try and dispel her doubts, but somehow he always keeps her going. There's always enough for her to kind of think that he's okay.
Have you watched the television show, The Americans, the series?
I've watched some of it, yeah.
Oh my gosh, I kept thinking of because they go out and they seduce other people, and I kept thinking about this character, Sylvia. Trotsky is increasingly isolated in Mexico. He has a very small entourage. He runs into, and I had no idea this, he ran into Kahlo, Frida, and Diego Rivera.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, colorful artists.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary sort of kink in the story,
Yeah, stayed at their house, eventually gets kicked out of their house because he's kind of obnoxious, or they get tired of having this house guest for so long.
Well, also that he has an affair with Frida Kahlo.
Well, yeah, that's a little problem too. Sorry.
I mean, especially given, I think Diego Rivera, it's kind of a weird one where Diego Rivera at the time was the far more famous, far more significant, or considered significant artist. Frida was just his wife, really, in comparison. But he was also the kind of person that carried a gun. He announced that he would shoot anyone who slept with his wife, which was sort of the height of hypocrisy, because he was sleeping with everyone, including her sister. He's the person that helped sponsor Trotsky's arrival in Mexico. And and it's sort of weird that you're not accustomed to writing stories where muralists sort of figure quite largely. He's the great muralist 20s and 30s, and did these astonishing paintings, which are sort of like this mad mix of like Goya and Caravaggio, but also sort of Aztec art and things. And it's an amazing kind of paintings that could only have come from Mexico, could only have come from someone like Diego Rivera. But yeah, eventually they fall out. And so Trotsky's living in this kind of compound. His life is a person who once, commanded armies, once set fair to become the ruler of the second big empire in the entire world, is living this tiny, circumscribed life where he can barely go out. And if he does go out, he has to sort of hide underneath the seats of the car so he doesn't get spotted. He's powerless. Almost his entire family has been wiped out by this stage, whether that's deliberately, directly in the sense of being poisoned, which may or may not happen to one of his sons. Another one disappeared into Stalin's camps. His two daughters were basically harried into death. Anyone he's ever really sort of almost ever corresponded with, to have known Trotsky becomes in the Soviet Union almost as if tantamount to a death sentence. To have delivered him a letter once, to have been in the same room with him, means that you are an object of suspicion. So anyone that could potentially ever communicate with him, support him, help him, has either disappeared into camps, had a bullet put in the back of their head, or has done what the other sort of acceptable thing as far as Stalin is concerned, which is a complete recantation, to become someone who is fiercely against Trotsky as anyone else on the planet. But even that is usually not enough in the long run, unless everyone dies. And he knows that every letter he sends is being read, that every letter he receives has already been read. He knows that there probably are people in the household who are spying on him. And he knows that there are people all around him that want him dead, that are plotting, that are looking for the weakness in the door, the guard that doesn't do a proper shift, so doesn't watch properly. All of these things, he knows it's coming.
He does. He knows it's coming. And on the day he's killed, he's feeding his rabbits and writing in his study where he is killed. What happens to Ramon after he is killed? What happens to Sylvia and Ramon after Trotsky, after the deed is done?
Ramon, he arrives with the sort of famous pickaxe, but also with a letter, which is nominally his cover story. So basically, he has found his way into Trotsky's entourage by posing as a sort of bored, dissolute Belgian playboy called Jacques Monard, and that's what they all know him as. So he initially affects to have absolutely no interest in politics, but then sort of in the summer of 1940 becomes incredibly interested in it. And so the letter that he's carrying with him basically says that he had been a passionate Trotskyist, but then Trotsky's sort of many sins and plots and flaws has turned him against him, and that's why he's killing him. In the aftermath of the killing, where he's sort of dragged down by Trotsky's guards and sort of beaten to a bloody pulp, he's then taken to prison, and he spends the next 2 decades holding stubbornly to his story, pretending that he has nothing to do with the NKVD, that he's just this sort of innocent who was pushed to the edge of what he could tolerate and finally took justice into his own hands. His mother, who had been in a car just outside Trotsky's house waiting to take him away in the event that he managed to kill Trotsky and then escape successfully, she returns with the rest of the NKVD unit to the Soviet Union, where initially she's greeted as a hero, as they always are. She's given, I think in his absence, sort of the Order of the Soviet Union. But very quickly, she has this sort of, I think it dawns on her, the sort of sheer scale of what she's done and what she's let her son into. She suddenly realizes that she's embroiled her son in this terrible thing, that she's ruined her son's life, and that she's also lost him. They adored each other. And I think whatever however unhealthy their relationship, because I think no one would ever suggest that a mother who encourages her son to become a political assassin that's a healthy relationship.
Right.
I think she becomes bitter, she drinks, she smokes, she sort of paces around her small apartment in Moscow, pesters the NKVD to do something. And I think the NKVD have their own plans. They funnel money into the prison where Ramon is being kept so he can live comfortably. And he lives so comfortably that he actually marries while he's in there. And I think they are probably plotting at some point to spring him out of jail. But she kind of goes rogue and does this sort of ludicrous attempt to free him, which basically only means that the security around him is amped up. And, she basically guarantees that he will have to serve the full sentence.
It's a crazy story.
It's completely mad. And I didn't really have time to go into it, but it kind of gets wilder and wilder. The more that you pull the threads, wherever you land, it ends somewhere sort of pretty mad.
What happened to Sylvie? What had happened to her?
And she's very sad. So initially there's sort of, understandably, there's a great deal of suspicion about her and her motives and her whatever role she did and didn't play in the murder. And alongside that, she's completely distraught. She realizes she's been used and she's been manipulated and she's been used as this sort of puppet. And that, she understands, she's clever. She understands that without her and the role she played, none of this would have happened, no matter how unwitting it was. So she's arrested. The FBI take a kind of close interest in her. But eventually, within a matter of days, she's released. She returns to the United States, basically hides for the next 3-4 decades of her life. I think she's an elementary or a sort of kindergarten teacher. She changes her name, lives quietly with one of her sisters, fades quietly into obscurity.
Just incredible. I tell you, folks, you have to read this story and I'm surprised this story doesn't have more traction because It's why I do nonfiction. Who needs fiction when you've got stuff like this in the world? I mean,
yeah, I think there are definitely details here where you think if I'd been written a novel and made it up, it would have.
It's why I'm a nonfiction book podcast reader, host, because I tell you, truth and reality is crazier than anything we can think up on our own human selves. So, I mean, it's just incredible. How long did you take to research this book?
The research was about 3 years.
It's well written. It's easy to follow. You got to kind of get over some of the Russian names. And it's like in reading any Dostoevsky novel. You have to keep looking at the names because the names are truly foreign to us, right? But it's well worth the read. When is this going to be out for
It's out on
publication?
the 24th in America and the 26th of February in the United Kingdom.
Okay, great. So next week, guys.
Yeah, next week, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'll try to have this up next week when it's...
Brilliant. Yeah, that'd be amazing, yeah.
Okay. So again, it's The Death of Trotsky, the true story of the plot to kill Stalin's greatest enemy by Josh Ireland. Josh, do you have a website where we can find you?
Yeah, I think it's just Josh Island. I think
Original?
I'm pretty bad at everything.
Okay, great. So folks, go look at his website, and really, this is a book you want to go out and buy. It's a good book because we did talk about it, and you know how the story ends. There's some great detail in here, and I have to tell you, folks, read this, read it with intent and seriousness, and it's not far to imagine today's Russia from this either. So, yeah, just let that be said. Anyway, Mr. Ireland, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I really enjoyed being on. Thank you.
I wish you the best with this book.
Thank you very much.